Deadwood, American West, 1882. A giant of a man kicks a woman into the mud in the middle of the town square. Nobody moves. Nobody breathes. Then a child's voice tears through the silence. "Someone, please save my mother." One man steps out of the crowd. Quiet, unhurried, like he's already decided how this ends. A gunshot. The giant goes down screaming. The sheriff draws his weapon. The stranger doesn't flinch. He pulls out a tarnished badge and holds it up in the open sun. This territory is under federal investigation. Sheriff. A widow who won't break. A haunted ex-marshal with nothing left to lose. A 9-year-old girl braver than every man in that town. And one water source worth killing for. Stay with us, because it starts right now. The sun hammered Deadwood like it had a personal grudge. It was barely past 9 in the morning, and already the air shimmered above the packed dirt of the main square. Dogs had sense enough to find shade. Most men didn't bother. Clara Hayes stood in the middle of that square and held her ground. She was 28 years old, slim but strong in the way that only hard work makes a person. Her dark hair was pinned back under a sun-faded hat. Her boots were cracked at the toe. She hadn't slept more than 4 hours, and it showed in the set of her jaw tight, deliberate, the face of a woman who had already decided she wasn't going to cry. Deputy Cord loomed over her like a wall of bad intentions. He was enormous, barrel-chested, thick-necked, with hands the size of dinner plates and a reputation for using them. He held out the land deed, and his voice dropped to something that was supposed to sound reasonable. "Sign it, Mrs. Hayes. Make this easy on yourself." Clara looked at the paper. She looked at him. "No," that was all she said. Just no, one word, quiet and clear. Cord's face changed. He moved fast for a big man. His boot caught her square in the side, and she went down hard into the mud. The breath knocked clean out of her. The deed fluttered out of her hand. Her hat tumbled off her head. She lay there for a moment, cheek pressed into the wet earth, blinking at the legs of the crowd gathered around the square's edge. Those legs didn't move. 20, maybe 30 people standing there. Ranchers, merchants, women with market baskets. They all saw it, every single one of them. And they looked at their boots, or the sky, or the empty space just past Clara's shoulder. That was Deadwood. You learned fast that keeping your head down was how you kept your head. Then a small voice split the silence wide open. "Someone, help please save my mother." Lily, Clara's 9-year-old daughter, stood at the edge of the crowd, both fists clenched at her sides, her face white as chalk. The girl was shy under normal circumstances. The kind of child who hid behind her mother's skirts when strangers came to the door. But she was screaming now, her voice cracking on every word, tears streaming clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Nobody moved. Cord reached down and grabbed the deed out of the mud. He glanced over at Lily with complete indifference. Then he looked back down at Clara. "Last chance," he said. A man stepped out of the crowd. He wasn't loud about it. He didn't announce himself. He just stepped forward, the way you'd step through a door, calm and certain. And he put himself between Cord and Clara. Silas Reynolds was lean and trail-worn, somewhere in his mid-30s, with 2 days of dust on his coat, and the kind of stillness that came from having been in dangerous places, long enough that danger stopped surprising him. His duster was the color of old rust. His hat was pulled low. There was nothing flashy about him at all. He looked at Cord. "That's enough." Cord blinked. He actually blinked, like the word didn't register. Then a slow smile spread across his face. "Walk away." "Stranger." Silas didn't walk away. What happened next took about 2 seconds. He drew and fired in one motion, and Cord went down screaming, clutching his shattered knee. The gunshot rolled across the square like thunder. A woman in the crowd gasped. A horse tied to the post yanked hard at its rope. The smell of powder drifted out over the mud. Cord was enormous even on the ground. He was still enormous. But down there in the mud, gripping his ruined leg, bleeding and breathless, he looked a lot smaller than he had a moment ago. Silas crouched beside him. His voice was level, almost quiet. "You're going to apologize to that little girl." Right now. Out loud, so she hears it. Cord stared at him. You're out of your... I won't ask twice. Something in the way Silas said, it made Cord believe him. The deputy looked across the square at Lily, still standing rigid at the crowd's edge, still crying, watching every second of this with wide, dark eyes. I'm Cord started, and coughed, and forced it out. I'm sorry, girl. I'm sorry. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't sincere. But Lily heard it, and something in her small face shifted. Silas stood up. The sound of a hammer clicking back cut through the square. Sheriff Malachi Vance had appeared at the far end, tall and iron gray, his revolver raised and aimed. He had the look of a man who had spent years cultivating the patience to be cruel on his own schedule. Drop the iron, Malachi said, slowly. Silas reached into his coat instead. He pulled out a badge. It was old, a little tarnished, but the shape was unmistakable. U.S. Marshal. He held it up between two fingers so the whole square could see it. His voice carried without effort. This territory is under federal investigation. Sheriff, you shoot me. You're shooting a federal officer. You want to explain that to the territorial judge. It was a bluff. Maybe the badge was real enough, even if the investigation wasn't. But nobody in that square knew the difference. And Malachi, for all his power in Deadwood, was smart enough to understand one thing clearly. Witnesses changed everything. His jaw tightened. His gun stayed raised for a long, ugly moment. Then slowly, he lowered it. He pointed one finger at Silas. This isn't finished. No, Silas agreed. It isn't. Clara had gotten herself back to her feet by then. She didn't take anyone's hand to do it. She picked up her hat, pressed it back onto her head, and found her daughter in the crowd, and held her close. She didn't look at Silas yet, but Lily did. The ride back to the Hayes Ranch was quiet. Silas kept his horse a few lengths behind Clara's wagon. She hadn't invited him to ride alongside her. She hadn't said much of anything since the square, beyond a short, clipped follow, if you want, that was barely louder than the wind. So he followed, and he stayed back, and he watched the road. Lily sat in the wagon bed with her knees pulled up to her chest and her eyes fixed on Silas the whole way. Not suspicious. Exactly. More like she was trying to figure out what he was. She'd stopped crying. Her face was still blotchy from it, but she was quiet now, and she watched him with the focused, unblinking attention of a child who had learned that adults were worth studying carefully before you trusted them. He didn't try to charm her, didn't wave or smile or say something cheerful. He just rode and let her look and left her to her own conclusions. The ranch came into view about 20 minutes outside of town. It was a working ranch, or had been once. The main house was solid timber and adobe, low-roofed, practical, the kind of place that had been built by someone who intended to stay. The barn needed paint. One of the fence posts along the eastern paddock had gone crooked, and nobody had fixed it yet. The vegetable garden near the porch was doing well, though someone had tended it carefully and recently. Clara jumped down from the wagon before the wheels had fully stopped, and by the time Silas dismounted, she was already on the porch steps with her Winchester leveled at his chest. No hesitation, both hands steady. She'd done this before. Stop there, she said. He stopped. They looked at each other across the length of the yard. Silas kept his hands loose and visible, away from his coat, fingers spread. He'd learned a long time ago that with a frightened, capable person, fast movements were the enemy. Thank you, Clara said, for what you did in town. I mean that. But, he said, but this is my land. Her voice didn't waver. My fence line, my rules. I don't know who you are, beyond a name I haven't even heard yet, and a badge I have no way to verify. And I have a daughter inside this house. My name's Silas Reynolds, he said. The badge is real. The investigation. I stretched the truth on that part. Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. You admit that freely? You're pointing a rifle at me. Seems like a good time, to be honest. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. Not warmth either. More like recalibration. She was measuring him, the same as Lily had done on the road. And he got the feeling that both of them were very good at it. I need a hired hand, she said finally. The ranch is behind on repairs. I have 40 head of cattle and one functioning irrigation line, and I haven't slept a full night in 3 weeks. She paused. I pay fair. Meals included. You sleep in the barn. You knock before you come within 10 yards of this house. You don't touch anything that isn't yours. You don't speak to my daughter unless she speaks to you first. And if I tell you to leave, you leave. That day, that hour. Understood, Silas said. I'm not finished. She lowered the rifle, but only to hip height. I don't know what you're after, Mr. Reynolds. Maybe it's the water source. Maybe it's something else. But I want you to know that I've survived everything this valley has thrown at me so far without help. And if it comes down to it, I'll survive you too. It was the plainest, most direct speech he'd heard in years. No performance to it. She meant every word. I believe you, he said. She studied him a moment longer. Then she turned and went inside and let the screen door shut behind her. Not a slam, just closed, firm and final. Silas stood in the yard for a moment. Then he led his horse to the water trough, unsaddled it, brushed it down, and found himself a corner of the barn where the hay was clean. He hung his coat on a nail, pulled off his boots, and lay back with his hands folded behind his head. The barn smelled like horses and dry wood and the faint sweetness of old hay. A cat he hadn't noticed before appeared on a beam above him and stared down with orange eyes. He slept better than he had in months. In the morning, he was up before the sun. He found the crooked fence post first and fixed it without being asked, resetting the base and tamping the dirt firm with the back of a flat stone since he couldn't find a proper mallet. Then he located the woodpile, which was low, and spent an hour splitting and stacking until it was right. By the time Clara came out of the house, she stopped on the porch and took in the fence, the woodpile, the water trough he'd scrubbed clean of algae, and the barn door he'd rehung so it didn't drag. She didn't thank him. She handed him a tin cup of coffee that was black and strong and too hot to drink quickly. He accepted it and said nothing. That was how the first week went. Silas worked from sunup to well past dark. He didn't offer opinions unless asked. He didn't try to take things over. When Clara was repairing the irrigation line, and she had a better method than his, he stepped aside and watched and handed her tools when she needed them. When she solved a problem, he was still thinking through. He nodded and let her lead. He noticed that she noticed. She was always watching, though she pretended not to. Lily was slower to emerge. She stayed close to her mother for the first few days, peering at Silas from behind the corner of the house or through the kitchen window. He did nothing to close that distance. He just went about his work, kept his voice down, and made sure she could always see where he was and what he was doing. On the fourth day, she appeared at the barn door while he was mending a bridle. She stood there for a while without speaking. He kept working. Do you actually know how to use that? She said finally, pointing at the old marshal's star he'd left sitting on the workbench. Used to, he said. Why'd you stop being a marshal? He glanced at her. That's a longer story. I'm 9, she said. I have time. He almost smiled. Fair enough. I'll tell you some of it later, but not standing in a doorway. Come in or don't. She came in. She sat on an overturned bucket about 6 feet away from him and watched him work in silence for nearly 20 minutes before she spoke again. They talked about nothing particularly important, the cat in the barn, whether the creek ever flooded, what the fence posts were made of. Small things, safe things. But she kept coming back every day after that, a little closer, a little longer. And Silas, who had spent years moving from place to place and keeping himself at a careful distance from anything that might matter, let her. One evening, about 2 weeks in, Clara found him sitting on the back steps after supper, whittling. He had a small piece of pine wood in one hand and a knife in the other, and he was shaping it into something that was starting to resemble a handle. Lily was beside him, watching intently. Clara leaned in the doorway and listened. You hold it like this, Silas was saying, adjusting the way Lily gripped her own small piece of wood. He'd given her a blunt-edged penknife that could barely cut butter. Slow strokes, always away from your body. You're not fighting the wood. You're working with it. Lily frowned at her piece. It looked like a lopsided potato. It's not coming out right. It takes time, he said. Everything worth doing takes more time than you think it should. Did yours take a long time? Still working on it. Lily looked at his piece, then at hers, then made another careful stroke. A thin curl of wood fell into her lap. She looked up at him like she'd done something remarkable. Better, he said. He finished shaping his piece and held it up. It was a small knife, smooth-handled, not quite 4 inches long, perfectly balanced. He offered it to Lily. She took it with both hands and turned it over carefully. A person's worth is forged by their own 2 hands and their courage to fight back, he said. Not by their bloodline, not by whether they're a boy or a girl, or how much land their family owns. You made something tonight with your own hands. That means something. Lily looked at the knife he'd made, then at the lopsided potato shape in her own palm. Mine's ugly, she said. So was my first one. He picked up his coffee cup. Keep it anyway. Clara, in the doorway, said nothing, but she stayed there for a long time. After she could have gone back inside, that night, lying awake on her side of the thin adobe wall, she thought about what it meant that a man's first instinct, when given time and quiet, was to teach a child something useful. She thought about it for a very long time. She had not planned to trust Silas Reynolds. She had not planned to watch for him at the window each morning, or notice the way he checked on the horses before he did anything else, or feel something loosens slightly in her ribs when she heard his voice talking quietly to her daughter in the barn. She hadn't planned any of it, but plans. Clara knew better than most, rarely survived contact with real life. Malachi Vance rode out to the ranch on a Tuesday. There was no warning. Clara was in the garden pulling weeds when she heard hooves on the road, and by the time she stood up and got her hand near her rifle, the sheriff was already at the gate with 2 of his men behind him, all 3 of them moving at a lazy walk that was designed to look like courtesy, but was really just patience. Silas was at the far end of the yard splitting wood. He heard the horses, too. He set the axe down, leaned it against the block, and stayed exactly where he was. Malachi dismounted like a man arriving at his own property. He was tall and lean, silver-haired, with a face that had started out handsome and gone cold over time. He dressed well for a frontier sheriff pressed shirt, good boots, a hat that hadn't seen a day of field work. He carried authority the way some men carried guns, openly expecting people to notice. He looked at Clara first, then his gaze moved to Silas, measuring and flat. Clara, he said, you're looking thin. Malachi, she said. He pushed the gate open and came into the yard. His men stayed outside. That was the move of a man who wanted to look reasonable, who wanted witnesses to see him being reasonable, so that later, when things stopped being reasonable, he could point back to this moment. Silas had seen it before. He stayed by the woodpile and watched. I came to talk, Malachi said. Just family business. The word family landed strange. Silas caught it in Clara's expression, a small tightening around the eyes, something between grief and contempt. Then he understood. Malachi Vance was her brother-in-law, her late husband's brother, which made him Lily's uncle. He filed that away quietly and kept his face neutral. Say what you came to say, Clara told him. Malachi pulled a folded paper from his inside coat pocket and held it out. I had my lawyer look at the territorial inheritance laws. Turns out the state has some fairly specific language about widowed property owners and the transfer of water rights. He unfolded the paper slowly, particularly when there's an underage heir involved. Clara crossed her arms. Keep talking. The law says a single woman managing property with a minor dependent is required to designate a male custodian for the water rights. Legal protection, they call it. He smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. As Thomas's nearest living kin, I'm the natural choice. I'd be designated custodian. You'd keep the house, keep the land. I'd just manage the water source until Lily comes of age. The lie was constructed carefully. That was the thing about Malachi. He didn't bully the way Cord did. Cord used his size. Malachi used language, layers of it, building something that sounded just plausible enough to make you doubt yourself. Clara knew it was a lie. Silas suspected she knew. But there was something corrosive about a confident lie, stated calmly by a man with legal paper in his hand. It made you want to check. It made you want to ask someone else. It created a crack. Clara stood in that yard, with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and she looked at that paper, and she did not flinch. That law doesn't exist, she said. Malachi looked patient, sympathetic, even. Claire, I've read the territorial statutes. All of them. Thomas made sure of that before he died. There is no such requirement. She paused. And there's no such thing as water right custodianship in this territory. You made that up. Something shifted behind Malachi's eyes. It was gone quickly, replaced with the sympathy again. You're under a lot of strain. Don't do that, she said. Don't talk to me like I'm confused. I'm not confused. Silas watched the whole thing from the woodpile with his arms loose at his sides. Every instinct he had said, step in. Say something. Make Malachi feel the weight of another man's attention. He didn't. Clara was right. She was more than right. She had the facts, and she was stating them clearly and calmly. And it would do her no good at all for a man to step up beside her like she needed backing. What she needed was space to be heard, and for her to know that he'd seen her handle it. So he waited. Malachi folded the paper back up. He looked at it for a moment, then put it away. The performance of a man choosing patience over conflict. Think about it, he said. For Lily's sake. Lily's sake is exactly why I'm saying no. Malachi looked at her a moment longer. Then he looked at Silas. Reynolds, he said, how long do you think a federal bluff lasts in a territory where I've been sheriff for 11 years? Silas held his gaze. Long enough. It wasn't a real answer. It didn't need to be. What it said was, I'm still here, and I'm paying attention. And you should factor that in. Malachi received it correctly. He put his hat back on, turned around, and walked back to his horse. He didn't look back. His men fell in behind him, and they rode out at the same lazy walk they'd arrived with. Clara didn't move until the sound of the hooves had faded completely. Then her shoulders dropped about half an inch, and she let out a breath. Silas picked up the axe and went back to splitting wood. Later, she came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one without a word, and they stood in the yard together and watched the road for a while, not speaking. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was just 2 people occupying the same air after a hard thing had passed. He's been pushing for 2 years, Clara said finally, since Thomas died. What was Thomas like? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. Good. A good man. Patient. He loved this land, and he was fair to everyone on it. She looked at her coffee. He didn't like to talk about Malachi, said his brother had chosen a different road a long time ago, and there was no use mourning it. Smart man, Silas said. He was. She paused. He would have liked you. That's a strange thing to say to someone you barely know. It's honest, though. She looked at him sideways. I say a lot of things I shouldn't. Seems like a strength to me, he said. She didn't answer that. She took her coffee and went back inside. But there was something different in the set of her shoulders, looser, somehow, than it had been an hour ago. That evening, Silas found Lily on the back steps with the wooden knife he'd given her, turning it over and over in her hands. She did that when she was thinking hard about something. He sat down beside her without being asked, which was new. She didn't pull away. He's my uncle, she said. It wasn't a question. I know, he scares me. She said it simply, the way children say true things, without apology. He always has, even when Papa was alive. He'd look at me, and I couldn't tell what he was thinking. Silas thought about what to say and decided to tell her the truth. Some people use family like it's a debt you owe them, he said. Like because you share blood, you're supposed to trust them automatically. That's backwards. He looked at the knife in her hands. Trust is something you build. It takes time, and it takes proof. Family doesn't skip the line. Lily turned the knife over once more. Mama doesn't trust him. Your mother is smart. Are you scared of him? He thought about it honestly. I'm careful around him, he said. There's a difference. Scared is when fear makes you do something stupid. Careful is when you use the fear to stay sharp. Lily considered that, with the seriousness of someone being given information they intended to keep. Okay, she said. She went inside a few minutes later. Silas stayed on the steps until the stars came out. Listening to the night sounds of the ranch settle around him, The horses shifting in the barn, the crickets in the dry grass, the faint creak of the windmill, and he thought about Malachi Vance with his folded paper and his lawyer's language and his dead brother's land. There was something wrong with the man that went deeper than greed. Silas had arrested enough dangerous men to recognize the shape of it. It was the particular flatness behind the eyes, the way the smile never connected to anything real underneath it. Malachi wasn't just hungry for the water source. He was the kind of man who needed to win. And that made him more dangerous than a man who just needed money. Because money had a stopping point. Winning didn't. The irrigation line ran from the underground source on the east side of the property, cut through roughly 400 yards of dry earth, branched twice, and emptied into a stone cistern near the main house. It was a good system. Someone had built it well. 20 years ago at least. But 20 years of drought and freeze cycles and general hard use had done their work. And now there were 3 separate failure points that were losing water before it reached the cistern. Silas found all 3 of them in one morning of walking the line slowly. He brought Clara out and showed her. She crouched by the first failure point, a section where the clay pipe had cracked at a joint, and looked at it for a long time. I knew it was losing pressure, she said. Didn't know where. 2 more down the east branch, he said. One's worse than this. She sat back on her heels. I priced the clay pipe in town last month. I don't have enough for all 3 repairs. You don't need clay pipe for all of them, he said. 2 of them can be packed with a good river clay mixture and sealed with pitch. It'll hold through the summer. The 3rd one, the bad one, that's the only one needs replacing. She looked at him. You know how to do that. I grew up on a ranch. My father was the cheapest man alive. You learn to fix things with what's around. Something crossed her face, not quite a smile, but close. All right, she said. Show me. That was how they started working the irrigation line together. It took 3 full days. They dug out the cracked sections by hand, working in the early morning before the heat got serious. And then again, in the late afternoon when it broke. Lily came with them and made herself useful in the way children do when they're not being condescended to. She carried tools, handed things over when asked, fetched water from the cistern when they needed it. Silas never treated her like she was in the way. He told her what they were doing and why at each step, and she listened with her whole body, the way she did when something interested her. Why does the water move that way? She asked on the 2nd day, watching the slow trickle through the repaired section. Pressure, Silas said, tamping river clay around a joint. Water always wants to go somewhere. If you give it a good path, it'll get there. If you block it up or let the path fall apart, it doesn't disappear, it just finds a crack and goes sideways. Lily thought about that. Like people. He looked up at her. She was dead serious. Exactly like people, he said. Clara, who was sealing the joint beside him with pitch, said nothing. But he caught the way she went still for just a second before she kept working. By the 3rd day, the cistern was filling properly for the first time in months. They stood around it in the late afternoon, the 3 of them, tired and mud-caked and genuinely dirty in the satisfying way that only comes from real work, and watched the water rise. Lily stuck her hand in. It's cold. It comes from underground, Clara said. The earth keeps it cool. That's why everyone wants it, Lily said. It wasn't a childish observation. It was a clear-eyed, precise reading of the situation. And both adults heard it that way. Silas looked at Clara. She looked back. Yes, she said simply. That's why, that evening, Clara cooked a proper supper. Not the quick, practical meals she'd been putting together. This was roast chicken and cornbread and boiled greens from the garden, and she'd made a cobbler out of dried apples that had been in the pantry since fall. She set it on the table with the good plates, the ones Silas hadn't seen her use before. He sat down and looked at the spread and said nothing. You fixed the irrigation, she said. We eat like people tonight. Lily had already reached for the cornbread. Silas followed her lead. They ate together and the conversation was easy. Easier than anything had been since he'd arrived. Lily talked about the cat in the barn, who she'd named Jefferson for reasons she was unwilling to fully explain. Clara talked about the east fence that still needed attention. Silas asked about the history of the ranch, and Clara told him how her parents had homesteaded it, how she and Thomas had taken it over when her father's back gave out, how they'd expanded the herd the first 3 years, and then lost half of it to a wet summer and a cattle disease that had swept through the whole valley. Thomas was good with the cattle, she said. Better than me. I'm better with the land itself. The growing things. The garden shows it, Silas said. She looked at him steadily. You pay attention. Habit, he said. Martial habit. Just habit. After Lily had gone to bed and the plates were cleared, Clara poured 2 cups of coffee and sat back down at the table. Silas stayed, and neither of them manufactured a reason to leave, which was its own kind of thing. The lantern threw a warm circle of light across the table between them. Outside, the night was quiet. Out here, away from town, the quiet had a different quality, full instead of empty. The kind that came from knowing the land was there. Sleeping. You said you'd tell Lily the long story sometime, Clara said, about why you left the Marshalls. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. I said some of it. You don't have to tell me. I know. He was quiet for a moment. There was a family, immigrant family. Came up from the South, father, mother, 3 children. They were living in a settlement outside of Laredo, and there was a man in that settlement who'd decided they had no right to be there. He made it known. Started with harassment, escalated. He stopped. I was the marshal in that district. I knew what was happening. I filed the reports. I told my superior it was going to go bad if we didn't move, and he told me to wait for solid evidence of a crime before I acted. He looked at the table. 2 weeks later, the man burned their house down, middle of the night. The father and the oldest boy got out. The mother and the 2 youngest didn't. The lantern flame shifted in some draft. Neither of them felt. I had the evidence then, Silas said. I arrested the man. He stood trial. He was convicted. He paused. And none of that did a single thing for that mother and those 2 children. Clara was quiet. I turned in my badge the week after the conviction, he said, because I'd followed the rules, and the rules had let those children die. And I couldn't figure out how to reconcile that. So I stopped. And since then, I've been drifting, he said it plainly, without drama, looking for something I could actually do instead of wait on. Clara looked at him across the table. The lantern light made her face look softer than it usually did. Though he didn't think she was softer, it was just the angle. What you did in the square, she said carefully, stepping out. That wasn't waiting. No, he agreed. That was choosing, she said. There's a difference between a bad system and bad choices. The system failed those children, but you didn't fail them. He opened his mouth, and she held up one hand, not stopping him, just asking for one more second. I'm not saying the grief isn't real, she said. I'm saying you've been carrying blame that isn't the right shape for you. What belongs to the system, you've put on your own back. She picked up her coffee. I've seen men do that before. It's a way of feeling like you had more control than you did. He was quiet for a long time. That's a hard thing to say, he said finally. You said I say things I shouldn't. I said it seemed like a strength. She met his eyes. Something moved between them across the table. An understanding, warm and careful. The kind that doesn't need to be spoken to be real. Neither of them looked away for a moment. Then Clara stood and picked up her coffee cup and said, "Good night, Mr. Reynolds," in a voice that was slightly lower than her normal register. "Good night," he said. He sat at that table for a good while after she'd gone, listening to the ranch settle into the dark, and for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember. The weight he'd been carrying didn't feel quite as fixed in place as it always had. It had shifted, just a little. But that was how everything started. The horseshoe was under the old oak by the creek bed, half buried in the roots where the soil had shifted after the spring melt. Silas almost missed it. He'd been following the creek line that morning, checking the banks for erosion after a heavy rain 2 days prior. And something caught his eye, a dull flash of iron just beneath the surface of the exposed root system. He crouched down and worked it free with his fingers. And when he turned it over in his hand, he stood there for a long time without moving. It was Thomas Hayes's shoe. He recognized the stamp on the inner curve. Clara had shown him the ranch's iron stamp on the first day, pressed into the wood of the barn door. A simple H with a bar beneath it. The farrier had used it on all the ranch horses. This was Thomas's saddle horse, the one he'd been riding the day he died. But the shoe had been tampered with. It wasn't worn through, the way a shoe went naturally when a horse spent enough miles on hard ground. The nail holes on the left side had been drilled out, not chipped, not worn drilled, with something precise, something deliberate. 3 of the 4 nails on the heel were gone, and the holes were clean. This shoe had been meant to come off. On a mountain trail, at speed, Silas wrapped it in his bandana and walked back to the ranch. Clara was in the barn when he came in. She was brushing down the gray mare, working methodically, the way she did everything without wasted motion. She looked up when she heard his boots on the barn floor, and something in his face made her stop. He held out the bandana and opened it. She looked at the shoe for a long time, without speaking. Then she reached out and took it from him and turned it slowly in both hands. Her fingers found the drilled nail holes the same way his had. She pressed her thumb against the clean edge of the nearest one, and her jaw went tight. Where? She said. One word, creek bed, under the old oak, east of the waterline. Soil shifted in the rain and exposed the roots. She turned the shoe over again. Her hands were very steady, which told him how much effort it was taking to keep them that way. He went down on the north trail, she said quietly. The horse threw him on the switchback. The drop was 40 feet. She paused. They said it was an accident. The horse was skittish. The trail was loose. Everyone said so. Everyone, Silas said carefully. Malachi said so. She looked up. He was the one who found him. The 2 of them stood in the barn in the afternoon light, and what had been a suspicion became something solid and terrible and real. Malachi Vance had not waited for his brother to die of old age. He had not waited for the law. He had pulled nails out of his brother's saddle shoe and sent him up a mountain trail and waited. Clara set the shoe down on the workbench. She pressed both palms flat against the wood and breathed. This is evidence, Silas said. Real evidence. If we can get this to a federal judge. Malachi owns the county judge, not the federal circuit. He's got no reach there. This shoe, combined with a sworn statement about the inheritance pressure and the forgery attempt, a federal prosecutor could open a murder inquiry. He paused. It wouldn't be fast, and it wouldn't be safe between now and when it lands. It's never been safe, she said. She picked the shoe back up and wrapped it in the bandana herself, tight and careful, and put it in the chest on the workbench shelf where she kept the ranch documents. She locked the chest. She put the key on the chain she wore around her neck, alongside her wedding ring. Then she turned around and looked at Silas with clear eyes. What do we do first? She said. They spent the rest of the afternoon going over it quietly, at the kitchen table, with Lily outside feeding the chickens. They mapped out what they had, the shoe, Clara's testimony about Malachi's repeated legal threats, the forged inheritance document he'd brought to the ranch, and Silas's own witness account of the incident in the square. Piece by piece, it was building into something. It wasn't enough yet, but it was getting there. Silas rode out to check the fence line as the sun went red and low. Clara started supper. Lily came in from the chickens and washed her hands and set the table without being asked. And for one quiet hour, the ranch felt like a place where things might actually turn out right. Then the night came apart. Silas smelled the smoke before he saw it. He was halfway back from the fence line when it hit him thick and dark. Not the clean smell of a cook fire, but the heavy, chemical smell of a barn burning. He turned the horse and drove it hard and crested the rise above the ranch to see the barn fully engulfed. Orange fire rolling up through the roof boards. Black smoke climbing straight into the still night air. He was off the horse before it had fully stopped. Clara was already out of the house with a bucket, which was a futile gesture. And she knew it. You couldn't throw a bucket at a fire that size, but she was trying because she was Clara, and she didn't stop trying. Lily was on the porch, pressed against the doorframe, white-faced and rigid. "Lily, stay there," Clara shouted. Silas grabbed Clara's arm as she swung past him. The horses are out. I checked the paddock on the way in. Don't go near it. She stopped, looked at the barn, looked at him. Something passed over her face. The calculation of someone figuring out what was actually worth saving. Then her eyes went to the chest in the barn. The documents, she said. I'll get them. Silas. He was already moving. The barn door was on the south side, away from where the fire had started. The roof was going, but the door itself wasn't burning yet. He wet his bandana at the water trough as he passed it, tied it over his mouth and nose, and went in. The inside was an inferno of heat and noise. Hay burned fast and bright, and the beams above him were already catching. He found the workbench by memory, moving low, eyes streaming. The chest was where Clara had left it. He grabbed it, tucked it under one arm, turned for the door. The beam came down without warning. It caught him across the left shoulder and drove him into the workbench edge. He felt the burn before he felt the pain, a long stripe of fire across his shoulder and upper back where the flaming timber had caught him. He went down on one knee, got back up, made the door. He came out of the barn into the night air and went down again in the dirt, coughing smoke out of his lungs in long, ragged pulls. Clara was there immediately, pulling the chest out from under his arm and hauling him further back from the heat. How bad, she said, checking the shoulder with quick hands. Manageable, he said, which was not entirely accurate. But his legs were working and his eyes were clear, and the chest was out of the barn. So he stood by that assessment. They stood back and watched the barn burn. It was a total loss. 20 minutes from the first spark to the collapse of the roof. Clara stood with her arms crossed and her face blank in the way that people go blank when they're protecting themselves from something too large to process immediately. Lily came off the porch and pressed herself against her mother's side. Clara put one arm around her without looking down. Then one of Malachi's deputies rode in at the gate. He was unhurried about it. That was the thing that made Silas's blood drop cold the complete, arranged calm of the man's arrival, like he'd been waiting just down the road for the right moment. Got a report of a fire, the deputy said, looking at the burning barn with no surprise at all. And a body. Clara went rigid. A body, Silas said, found in the barn. Appears to be cord. The deputy pulled out a paper, unfolded it, held it up like he was reading a church announcement. Sheriff Vance has issued an arrest warrant for Clara Hayes and one Silas Reynolds. Charges of arson and murder in the first degree. The world went very quiet. Silas looked at the burning barn. He thought about Cord Big, brutal Cord, who had kicked Clara into the mud and whose knee he had shattered. Cord, who had become a liability once he couldn't do the work Malachi needed him to do. Malachi had not only burned the barn, he had murdered his own crippled deputy, put the body in the fire, and built a murder charge around the two people most likely to expose him. It was efficient. It was ruthless. It was the move of a man who had been planning several steps ahead for a very long time. I'd advise you both to come quietly, the deputy said. Behind him, at the gate, two more riders materialized out of the dark. Silas looked at Clara. Her eyes were already moving fence line, tree cover, the dark road east toward the canyon. She had already done the math. He picked up the chest. She took Lily's hand. Run, he said. She did. They went east on foot, into the dark, away from the road. Silas carried the chest and pushed through the pain in his shoulder by concentrating on the ground in front of him. Clara carried Lily for the first mile, when the girl's legs gave out from exhaustion and fear. And then Lily got her second wind and ran on her own. Behind them, distant but coming, they could hear the posse assembling. The Red Rock Canyon rose ahead of them, black against the stars, vast and jagged and cold, and the only place within 20 miles that Malachi's men would hesitate to follow at night. Clara knew these rocks. She'd played in them as a child when her family had ranched the valley. She led them without hesitating, picking the path by starlight and muscle memory, up through a dry wash and into a narrow ravine that opened behind a shelf of sandstone into a shallow cave. It was cold inside. The stone held the cold the way it held heat in summer deep and thorough. The opening was narrow enough to defend and wide enough to see out of, and the cave went back far enough that a person could be invisible from the outside if they pressed against the rear wall. Clara got Lily settled against the back wall and wrapped her in Silas's duster, which he shed without her asking. Then she turned to look at Silas properly, and her face went tight at what she saw. His shirt was burned through across the left shoulder. The skin beneath it was raw and red, and already beginning to blister in long stripes. He was favoring that side without realizing it, and his face had the gray, set look of a man managing significant pain and not quite winning. "Sit down," she said. "Claire, sit down, Silas." He sat down. The cave was cold enough that their breath came out in small clouds. Clara worked fast. She had the canteen from her belt and the small roll of linen she always kept in her coat pocket, a habit from raising a child on a working ranch, where minor injuries happened constantly and the nearest doctor was a 2-hour ride. She had a folding knife and, in her inside pocket, a flat tin of pine pitch salve that she'd made herself from a recipe her mother had taught her. It wasn't much. It was going to have to be enough. She crouched in front of Silas. "Your shirt needs to come off." He reached up with his right arm to work the buttons, and his face went white on the third one. The burn across his shoulder had stiffened the muscle underneath. He kept going anyway. "Let me," she said. She worked the buttons herself, quickly, and pulled the shirt back off his shoulders with the careful efficiency of someone managing a task and not thinking about anything else. She folded it away and looked at the damage. It was worse than she'd hoped and better than she'd feared. The burn ran from just below the left shoulder blade up across the back of the shoulder in 2 long stripes, second degree, maybe just touching third at the worst point. The skin was already blistering in places, and the heat had gone deep enough that the muscle underneath was inflamed and locked. He had a collection of older scars, too. She noted them without comment. Long life, hard work, and more than one close call. None of that was her business. She opened the tin of salve. "This is going to hurt," she said. "Go ahead." She applied it with clean linen, working with light pressure, covering the burned area as completely as she could. He didn't make a sound. His right hand was flat on the cave floor beside him, and she watched his fingers press down against the stone, holding himself still by sheer determination. The temperature in the cave dropped further as the night deepened. The wind outside had started moving through the ravine with a low, mournful sound. Lily was asleep against the back wall, curled small under the duster, her breathing slow and even. Children could sleep through almost anything when exhaustion took over, and exhaustion had taken over hard. Clara's hands were almost numb by the time she finished bandaging the shoulder. She sat back on her heels and looked at her work in the dim light. Silas was shivering. Not dramatically, he was controlling it, but she could see the fine tremor in his arms, and she could see from his eyes that the fever had started coming in. Burns did that. The body went into shock from the heat damage, and the fever climbed fast. And out here, in a cold stone cave without medicine or blankets, that fever could kill him as efficiently as a bullet. She looked at the space in the cave. She looked at Lily. She looked at Silas, shivering and gray-faced and still upright by pure will. Then she made a practical decision, the way Clara always made decisions, by looking at the problem clearly and choosing the option that gave everyone the best chance. She moved behind him and sat against the cave wall and said, "Lean back." He turned his head. "Clara, you're going into fever shock. I have one coat and Lily needs it. Body heat is what we have." She kept her voice level. "Lean back, Silas." A moment. Then he leaned back against her, careful of his left shoulder, and she wrapped her arms around him from behind. Her hands crossed over his chest and held on. He was burning up and freezing at the same time. The way fever made a person feel the skin cold to the touch, but the interior radiating heat, like a banked fire. She could feel his heart beating under her hands, faster than it should have been, and the shivering slowly began to ease as her body heat transferred to him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The wind moved through the ravine. Lily slept, somewhere far down in the rock below them, faint and constant. They could hear the underground water, moving just a murmur, barely there. The pulse of the aquifer that had started all of this. I'm sorry, Silas said quietly. For the barn. You didn't burn the barn, she said. I brought this down on you faster. Malachi was always going to do something. You just made him move before he was completely ready. She paused. That's not a bad thing. A man who moves before he's ready makes mistakes. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel the effort it took him to stay present, to keep his focus against the pull of the fever. Tell me something, he said, to stay awake. What do you want to hear? Anything real. She thought about it. When I was 12, she said. My father took me out to the east field in the middle of a drought. Everything was dead. The grass, the creek, the garden, just brown as far as you could see. She shifted slightly, resettling her arms. He dug down about 3 feet with a post hole digger, right in the middle of that dead field, and he pulled out a handful of dirt from the bottom and put it in my hand. And the dirt was damp. She paused. He said, it's still down there. It doesn't disappear. It just goes deeper when things get hard. You have to be willing to dig. Silas was quiet. That's the aquifer, she said. That's what the whole ranch runs on. That's what Malachi wants to sell to the railroad. She paused. But that's also, I think about that a lot. When things go wrong, it's still down there. You just have to be willing to dig. Your father was a wise man, Silas said. His voice was getting slower. He was a tired man who got wise because he didn't have any other options. She could hear a slight smile in her own voice, surprising her. That's how most wisdom works, I think. He made a sound that might have been a laugh if he'd had the energy for it. His breathing deepened. The fever was still there, but the shivering had stopped, and his weight against her had gone from rigid to something heavier and more real. The weight of a person finally letting their guard down enough to rest. She stayed awake and held on. She told herself it was practical. She told herself it was survival math. His warmth helped her too in that freezing cave. And this was just 2 people using good sense in a bad situation. That was all true. It was also true that somewhere between the irrigation line and the lantern-lit table and this cave, she had started wanting him to be all right in a way that had nothing to do with good sense. She'd been trying to keep that observation at arm's length for a while now. And there, in the dark, with his weight against her and her arms around him, and the sound of the underground water underneath them, it was harder to manage. She pressed her forehead briefly against the back of his uninjured shoulder, just for a moment, just to know he was real and warm and still there. Then she sat back and kept watch on the ravine until the first gray light of dawn crept into the canyon and the posse's distant torches, visible through the night as moving orange points in the valley below, finally went still. He woke with his back against the cave wall, her coat over his chest, and Clara sitting at the cave opening with the Winchester across her knees, watching the canyon below with steady eyes. His shoulder was a world of pain. His mouth tasted like ash and metal. His head was clearer than it had been in the night, which meant the worst of the fever had broken. Lily was awake and sitting beside her mother, eating something from her coat pocket dried beef, by the look of it. How long, he said. Clara didn't turn around. You slept about 4 hours. It's early yet. They were moving in the valley until about 2 hours ago. He sat up carefully and looked at his shoulder. Clara had done a clean job of the bandaging. He tested the arm. The range of motion was bad, and the pain was significant, but it was workable. We need to talk about what comes next, he said. I know, she said. He moved up to sit beside her at the cave opening. Below, the canyon spread out in the early dawn, light, red rock, and shadow, the dark line of the ravine, and far down in the valley, the smudge of smoke where the barn had been. Lily looked at him. You don't look good, she said. I've been better, he admitted. Mama fixed you up, she said. She's good at that. I know, he said. I noticed. Clara turned from the opening and looked at him, and the thing that had been building between them was there in her face, in the early morning light, clear and unguarded for just a moment, before she put the practical expression back. Malachi will regroup and come up the canyon today, she said. He won't wait long. He knows we have the evidence, And he needs to end this before we find a way to get it out. Then we have today, Silas said. One day to change the math. Clara looked at the valley below. Then she looked at Lily. Then she looked at Silas with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, resolved. And something more than that. Decided. I'm not running anymore, she said. It wasn't a question and it wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact delivered, the way Clara delivered everything plainly, completely, without room for argument. Silas looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. Okay, he said. Then we need a plan. I have one, she said, and she began to talk. Clara's plan was simple enough to work and dangerous enough to matter. She was going to go back into Deadwood, not running through the back of town with her head down. Not sneaking into some sympathetic friend's kitchen. She was going to walk in on foot, in daylight, and she was going to talk to every person in that town who had stood in the square and looked at their boots while Deputy Cord put her face in the mud. Silas's first response was no. His second response was also no, delivered with more detail about the two riders he'd seen patrolling the canyon road at first light, the warrant with both their names on it, and the fact that his left arm was currently about 60% functional. Clara let him finish. Then she said, I'm not asking you to come with me. That stopped him. Lily stays with you, she said, in the cave. You keep her safe, and you rest that shoulder, because we're going to need you working when this comes to a head. She met his eyes. But I know this town. I know who's afraid, and I know why. And I know the difference between people who are indifferent and people who are scared. Scared people can be reached. And if Malachi's men pick you up before you reach anyone, then I use the evidence. I tell every single person I can find in the loudest voice I have what's in that chest and what that horseshoe means before they lay a hand on me. She paused. Malachi has kept power here by keeping people isolated. They don't talk to each other. They don't know who else feels the way they feel. That's how tyranny works. It makes everyone think they're alone. Silas was quiet. She wasn't wrong. He'd seen it work the same way before, in enough different towns to know. It wasn't specific to Deadwood. Fear was a management tool, and the first thing it required was silence. Break the silence, and the tool started to crack. Who do you go to first, he said. Abigail March, the schoolteacher. Clara picked up her hat and settled it on her head. She's been here 12 years. She knows everyone, and everyone trusts her. If I can convince Abigail, she'll do the rest of the talking herself. And if she doesn't open the door, she'll open the door, Clara said with certainty. She stood in that square, too. She's been standing in that square in one form or another for 12 years. People get tired of looking at their boots. Silas looked at her for a long moment. He thought about arguing further, and he thought about what it meant to argue further. And he decided that telling Clara Hayes what she could and couldn't do with her own conscience and her own courage was not something he had any business doing. Take the south path down, he said. It comes out below the old mill, away from the main road. Stay off Main Street until you've reached Abigail. I know this canyon. Silas, I know you do, he said. I'm just talking. Something in her face softened by a fraction. She looked at Lily, who was watching this whole exchange with wide eyes and a piece of dried beef going uneaten in her hand. Clara crouched down in front of her. I need to go do something important, she said. Mr. Reynolds is going to stay here with you. I need you to be brave for me. Lily's jaw went tight in a way that looked exactly like her mother. I'm always brave. I know you are. Clara put both hands on her daughter's face and looked at her straight. If anything happens, anything at all, that doesn't feel right, you do what Silas says. You hear me? Yes, ma'am. Clara kissed her forehead and stood up. She looked at Silas once more. He gave her a nod that meant several things at once, and she returned it. And then she was moving through the cave opening and down the ravine, quiet and quick, and the canyon closed around her, and she was gone. The walk into Deadwood took 2 hours by the south path. Clara's legs ached, and her throat was dry, and somewhere around the halfway point, she thought about Silas's voice saying one day to change the math, and she used it like fuel and kept moving. She came in behind the mill the way Silas had said. ducking through the shadow of the wheel housing, and she took the back alleys to Abigail March's cottage, which sat on the east side of town behind the schoolhouse. It was early still. The town hadn't fully woken up. She knocked at the cottage door. A long pause. Then the curtain at the window shifted. Then the bolt drew back, and the door opened 3 inches on a chain. Abigail March was in her 50s, gray-haired and sharp-faced, with eyes that had seen everything the frontier could put in front of a woman and were tired of pretending otherwise. She looked at Clara through the gap. "You've got a warrant on you," she said. "I know," Clara said. "Let me in anyway." Another pause. Then the chain came off, and the door opened. Abigail's cottage was small and neat and full of books, which was the thing Clara had always liked most about her. A woman with that many books had been doing her own thinking for a long time. She gestured Clara to a chair at the kitchen table and put a kettle on without asking, and Clara sat down and put the horseshoe on the table. Abigail looked at it for a moment. Then she sat down across from Clara, and Clara talked. She talked for 20 minutes, straight through, everything: the horseshoe, the drilled nail holes, the North Trail, Thomas's death, Malachi's inheritance manipulation, the forged documents, the barn, Cord's body, the warrant. She put it all on the table in plain language, the way her mother had taught her to tell a story, starting with the facts and letting the meaning speak for itself. Abigail listened without interrupting. Her face did not change much, but her hands, which had been folded on the table when Clara started, had tightened by the time Clara finished. "I knew about Thomas," Abigail said finally. Clara went still. "What do you know?" "I knew it wasn't an accident." Abigail looked at the horseshoe. "I didn't have any proof. I had an impression, a feeling based on 15 years of watching Malachi Vance operate." She pushed the horseshoe back across the table toward Clara. "I didn't say anything because I didn't have anything to say. Just a feeling against a county sheriff who controls the court, the deputies, and the jail." "And now," Clara said. Abigail looked at her. "Now you have the shoe, and I need people," Clara said. "Not guns necessarily, though guns would help. I need people who are willing to stand somewhere visible and be counted. Malachi's power comes from everyone believing he's the only option. The moment people see that's not true, the moment people see each other," Abigail said. "That's the thing. People in this town don't know they're not alone. Everyone thinks they're the only one afraid." "I know," Clara said. "That's exactly it. Give me 2 hours," Abigail said, and stood up. Abigail March, it turned out, knew everyone. But more than that, she knew which version of the truth to tell each person she went to, because she'd spent 12 years teaching the children of this valley, which meant she'd spent 12 years earning the trust of their parents. She knew who had been cheated by Malachi on a water rights dispute 3 years back, and who had a nephew sitting in the county jail on a charge that had never quite added up, and who had watched their family pushed off their property through a combination of legal pressure and convenient fires. Clara went with her to the first 3 houses, and then Abigail sent her to a different part of town. "You're wanted," she said briskly. "You being seen helps in some places and hurts in others. Let me work the ones where it hurts." Clara went to Elias Cole's place on the edge of town. Elias was 71, an old ranch hand who had worked the valley for 40 years, before his back gave out and his employer, Malachi's friend, as it happened, had let him go without pay for the last 2 months of his contract. He lived in a one-room house not quite inside town limits, tended a small garden, kept 1 goat, and was generally treated like furniture by the town's established order. He opened the door before she knocked. He'd seen her coming up the path. "Figured you'd get here eventually," he said. She told him everything. He stood in his doorway and listened, and when she finished, he said, "What do you need?" "I need you to ride with me to the canyon tomorrow," she said. "And I need you to bring anyone you can reach between now and then." "I'm old," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm old, and my back is bad, and the last time I rode hard, I could barely walk the next 3 days." "I know," she said again. "All right," he said. "Give me the night." She went back to Abigail as the sun was going low. They sat together at the kitchen table, and Abigail told her. house by house, who had said yes, and who had said maybe, and who had said nothing, which in some cases meant the same thing as yes. 14 confirmed. More possible by morning. Clara sat with that number for a moment. Is it enough? Abigail asked. It has to be, Clara said. Abigail poured them both coffee, and they sat in the warm kitchen, and the evening settled around them. And Clara thought about the cave in the canyon, and Lily asleep under Silas's duster, and the sound of the underground water moving in the rock, constant and patient and deep. Can I ask you something? Abigail said. Yes. Reynolds. She said the name carefully. How much do you trust him? Clara thought about it honestly. She thought about the square, and the fence post, and the irrigation line, and the barn. She thought about the lantern-lit table and the cave, and the way he'd said, okay, when she told him she wasn't running anymore. Just that one word. No argument. No condition. With my life, she said, with Lily's life. Abigail nodded slowly. Like that answered more than just the question. Good, she said. That's what it's going to take. Clara looked out the kitchen window at the darkening sky above Deadwood's roof lines, and she thought tomorrow everything comes to a head. She finished her coffee, thanked Abigail, and slipped back out into the dark. Dawn came into the canyon like a slow fire, red light bleeding across the rock walls from east to west, turning everything amber and rust and deep shadow. Silas was awake before it. He'd slept in short stretches through the night, waking every hour to check the ravine below and listen to the sounds the canyon made when something moved through it. Lily had slept straight through, curled against the cave wall, her wooden knife in her hand. She'd taken to carrying it everywhere since he gave it to her, not as a weapon, but as a comfort, something solid and made, and hers. Clara had not come back. He kept himself from reading too much into that. She'd said she needed time, possibly through the night. She knew what she was doing. He repeated both of those things to himself with some regularity, as the stars faded and the sky went gray, and then pink. Then just past first light, he heard boots on the ravine path. He had the rifle up before he saw her. Clara came through the ravine opening, with her hat pushed back and dust on her boots, and the look of someone who had been moving fast for hours. She saw the rifle, saw him lower it, and kept moving up to the cave entrance without breaking stride. 14 confirmed, she said. More by mid-morning. Abigail is bringing them up the south trail. He looked at her. She'd been walking all night, and she was steadier than most men he'd known after a full sleep. Elias, he'll ride. She sat down, with her back against the cave wall, and pulled her canteen. Malachi's going to move today. He'll know by now that I went into town. He can't afford to wait. He moved last night, Silas said. She looked up. 3 men came up the north approach about 2 hours before dawn. I tracked them to the upper shelf above the ravine. He paused. They're positioned to come down on us from above if we try to move toward the valley. He's boxing us in, she said. Trying to. He sat down across from her. If your people come up the south trail before Malachi moves, we have him flanked. If they're late, they won't be late, Clara said. Lily stirred at the sound of her mother's voice and rolled over and blinked at them both. She took in Clara's expression and Silas's bandaged shoulder and the general atmosphere of the cave, which had shifted overnight into something tighter and more purposeful. Today's the day, Lily said. It wasn't a question. Today's the day, Clara confirmed. Lily sat up and smoothed her hair back and picked up her wooden knife from where it had fallen in the night. She put it in her coat pocket. Then she looked at Silas with dark, steady eyes. What do we do? She said. He looked at this 9-year-old girl who had screamed for help in a public square and then watched everything that followed with the focused attention of someone filing it all away for later use. And he thought about every assumption adults made about children being too small and too frightened for the truth. We hold the cave entrance until Clara's people are in position, he said. Then we move to the waterfall. And then it ends, he said. She nodded, like that was a satisfactory answer. Because it was. They heard the posse before they saw it. Malachi had 12 men, and he didn't bother with subtlety. He came up the main canyon approach mid-morning, horses picking their way across the rock scree. the sound of iron shoes on stone, carrying a long way in the still air. He had two men still on the upper shelf, and Silas could see them from the cave entrance, two dark figures against the pale rock, rifles visible. Silas stood at the cave mouth with the rifle across his good arm. His left shoulder was burning steadily, and his range of motion was still limited. But he could hold a line, and he could stand upright, and he could make 12 men think twice about riding straight at him, which was all he needed to do right now. Malachi pulled his horse up about 60 yards out and looked up at the cave with flat, patient eyes. "It's over. Reynolds," he called, "send the woman and the girl out. I'll see to it you get a fair trial." The offer was so transparently false it was almost an insult to say out loud. Interesting offer from a man who burned a barn with his own deputy in it. Silas called back. A stir in the posse. Not all of those men knew what Malachi had done to Cord. The ones who didn't were now thinking about it. Malachi's jaw tightened. "Ride down, or we come up." "Come up, then," Silas said. The two men on the upper shelf started to move. Below, 3 riders broke from the posse toward the ravine approach, and then from the South Canyon ridge above and behind the posse. A voice cut down through the clear morning air. Malachi Vance. It was Abigail March, and she had the carrying voice of a woman who had managed schoolrooms for 30 years. Every head in the canyon turned. She stood on the south ridge with Elias Cole on one side of her and a line of armed townsfolk stretching out in both directions. Ranchers, farmers, the blacksmith, the widow who ran the dry goods store, the young man who swept out the saloon, and others. 23 people in all, some with rifles and some with shotguns, and a few with nothing but their physical presence, which in the context of a canyon with good acoustics was worth more than it might have seemed. The posse's escape route south was gone. Malachi looked up at the ridge. He looked at his men. He looked back up at the ridge. His face did something complicated and dark. "These are wanted criminals," he said loudly to the ridge. "You're interfering with a lawful arrest. Show us the law." Elias called back, in the voice of a man who had spent 70 years outdoors and could project across considerable distances. "Show us the federal statute. Show us anything signed by anyone above your own hand." Silence. Just the wind in the canyon and the distant sound of the underground water. One of Malachi's deputies, a young man in a brown coat, quietly walked his horse to the edge of the group and stopped. Then another one did the same. They weren't leaving. They were just no longer pressing forward, which amounted to the same thing. Malachi saw it. "Hold your positions," he snapped. Nobody moved, but nobody advanced either. Silas looked at Clara beside him at the cave entrance. She was watching Malachi with the clear, focused attention she'd given to the irrigation line, to the horseshoe, to every problem she'd decided to solve. She was watching for the moment. He stopped being a calculating man and became a cornered one. That moment was coming. She could see it. Malachi made his decision, the way dangerous men always did, when the calculated approach stopped working. He stopped calculating. He drew his revolver and drove his horse hard up the ravine approach. And 2 of his remaining loyal men came with him, and the canyon erupted. The shootout was close and brutal and loud. Gunfire rolled between the rock walls and doubled back on itself, so it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The townsfolk on the ridge fired down. Silas fired from the cave entrance. Men scattered for cover behind boulders and rock shelves, horses screaming and wheeling in the enclosed space. Silas had accounted for Malachi's 2 loyal riders, and he'd accounted for the men on the upper shelf, who had scrambled down and were now pinned behind a boulder by fire from the ridge. He'd placed Clara inside the cave with Lily and the chest of evidence, and he'd positioned himself at the ravine mouth, where he could see the main approach. What he had not accounted for was the 2 men who came up the back of the ravine from the east, through a crack in the rock that wasn't visible from the cave entrance. They came from behind him. The first one caught him across the back of his injured shoulder and drove him down onto the rock. The rifle skidded away. The second man was on him before he could get back to his feet, and they got his hands bound behind him with a leather cord, fast and tight. the work of men who'd done it before. They hauled him up and pressed him against the ravine wall, and the first man put a knife at his throat. "Tell them to stop firing," the man said. Silas didn't say anything. Then he heard a small sound from inside the ravine crack behind his captors. A scraping sound, like something small moving across jagged stone. The two men didn't hear it. They were watching the main canyon, watching the shootout, watching for Malachi's signal. Silas heard it again and kept his face completely neutral. The cord around his wrists went taut, then a small pressure, sawing back and forth, careful and determined and slow. Lily. She had come through the back crack in the rock, a gap barely wide enough for a child's body, which was precisely why no adult had thought to watch it. She was behind the two men, invisible from their angle, pressed flat against the rock, working the wooden knife back and forth across the leather cord with everything she had. It took 90 seconds. It felt like an hour. The cord gave. Silas moved. He took the knife hand first, driving the man's wrist back against the rock until the knife dropped. The second man swung at him, and he took the hit on his already damaged shoulder and went briefly white with pain and used the momentum of it to put the man into the ravine wall face first. They went down together. Silas came back up alone. He got the rifle. He looked back. Lily was pressed into the rock crack, both hands gripped around the wooden knife. Her face white, but her eyes completely steady. "Go back to your mother," he said. "Right now." She went. He turned back to the canyon. The main fight had moved toward the underground waterfall, where the aquifer surfaced in a roaring curtain of white water at the canyon's far end. The rock there was perpetually wet, green with moss, slick and treacherous. Malachi had gotten through the main line. He was at the waterfall now, and Clara was there too, because Clara had not stayed in the cave. Of course she hadn't. She stood on the rock shelf above the falls, with the locked chest under one arm and her rifle in her other hand, and Malachi was below her on the wet rock with his revolver raised. "Give me the chest," he said. "It goes to the federal circuit court," she said. That's what Thomas would have wanted. Something moved across Malachi's face at his brother's name. Grief, maybe. Or what passed for grief in a man who had pulled nails from his brother's saddle shoe. Whatever it was, it didn't slow him. He reached up and grabbed for the chest. Clara held on. They struggled for it on the wet rock, not a clean cinematic fight, but a desperate, ugly scrabble, the chest between them, water roaring and misting everything around them. Malachi was stronger. Clara was lower on the shelf with better footing. He got one hand on the chest and she pulled back, and his boot hit a moss-slicked stone and slipped. He let go of the chest to catch himself. He didn't catch himself. He went backward off the shelf, arms out, grasping at air, and the forged deed he'd pulled from his coat in the struggle blew free in the canyon wind and scattered into the waterfall in pieces. Malachi hit the water below the falls and the current, which was the ancient, patient, powerful current of an aquifer that had been running for 10,000 years, took him. Clara stood at the edge of the shelf and watched. The white water ran on. Silas reached her a minute later, breathing hard, blood on his coat from the shoulder. He came up beside her and looked at the falls and then at her face. She was still holding the chest. He put his hand over hers on the handle, and she let him, and they stood there together while the water roared, and the last of the gunfire went quiet the canyon, and the townsfolk came down from the ridge, and the whole long, terrible weight of it began. Finally, to lift, Lily appeared at Clara's other side. Clara looked down at her. "Are you hurt?" "No," Lily said. "Silas told me what you did." Lily looked at the wooden knife in her hand. Then she looked up at Silas. "You said a person's worth comes from their own two hands," she said. "I used mine." Silas looked at this small girl on the wet rock beside the roaring falls and found he didn't have a single thing to add to that. "Yes," he said, "you did." 4 months later, the valley looked different. It was small changes, mostly a new fence line here, a repaired roof there, cattle moving on land that had been locked up in legal disputes for 2 years. The dry goods store had expanded. There was a proper school building going up on the east side of Deadwood, with actual windows, which Abigail had campaigned for with the focused intensity of a woman who had been waiting a long time and was finished being patient about it. The federal circuit court had moved quickly, as federal courts went. The evidence in Clara's chest, the horseshoe, the deed, the correspondence, Silas's sworn statement, and testimony from 14 residents had opened a murder inquiry into Thomas Hayes's death. Malachi Vance's body had been recovered downstream 3 days after the canyon. The inquiry was ongoing, but the warrant against Clara and Silas had been dismissed in the first week. The Hayes Ranch had been rebuilt by the town itself. That had been Elias's idea, and nobody argued with a 71-year-old man on a horse with a bad back who had ridden up a canyon to stand on a ridge when it mattered. People showed up with timber and tools and food on a Saturday in late spring and built the barn back in 2 days. Clara had stood in her yard and watched the walls go up and said nothing for a long time. Then she'd fed everyone supper and said a great deal. The irrigation system was running clean. The cistern stayed full, the cattle were healthy, and the garden was doing well. And Jefferson the cat had turned out to be a mother, which explained some of his prior aloofness. And the kittens were causing a significant disruption to the orderly operation of the barn. Lily had named all 6 of them. She was also, at her own insistence, attending Abigail's school now. She'd been reluctant at first. She'd been tutored at home by Clara, and the idea of other children had seemed complicated after so long being cautious around people. But she'd gone one morning in early summer and come home talking so fast Clara could barely follow it, and she'd gone back every day since. She was still quiet. She was still watchful, but she laughed more now, and she'd started carrying the wooden knife in her pocket purely out of habit rather than comfort, which was a different thing entirely. Silas had stayed. That had happened gradually, the way real things happened, without a single clear moment where a decision was made. He'd stayed through the federal proceedings because his testimony was needed. He'd stayed through the barn building because there was work to do. He'd stayed through the summer because the east fence needed attention and the irrigation system needed monitoring. And Jefferson's kittens needed someone responsible to ensure they didn't undermine the structural integrity of the hay storage. He'd run out of practical reasons about 6 weeks ago. He was still there. He'd moved out of the barn and into the small side room off the main house that had been used for storage. Clara had cleared it out herself and said nothing about it beyond. The roof doesn't leak, and there's a good window, which he'd taken as the clearest invitation she was likely to issue. They worked alongside each other every day and talked every evening, and somewhere in there, the distance that had been carefully maintained between them had closed so gradually that neither of them could have said when exactly it happened. It had just become the shape of things. One evening in early fall, he found her on the porch after supper, watching the sun go down behind the western ridge. The sky was that particular color it got in September, deep orange fading to purple, the kind of sky that made the whole valley look like it was worth every single thing it had cost. He sat down beside her in the other chair. They watched the sky for a while. Lily asked me this morning if you were going to stay forever. Clara said, "What did you tell her?" "I told her to ask you herself." Clara paused. She said she was thinking about it. He looked at the last edge of orange on the ridge. He thought about what he wanted to say and decided to say it plainly, the way she'd always been plain with him, because she'd taught him that directness was a form of respect. "I don't have a badge anymore," he said. "Don't plan to get another one. I don't have a great deal of money. I have a horse and a good rifle, and I know how to fix irrigation lines, and I'm willing to work every day for the rest of my life." He paused. "And I'd like to do that work here, if you'll have me, as an equal partner in this land and everything on it. Your rules, same as always." Clara looked at him. "That's not a very romantic speech," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it's an honest one." She was quiet for a moment. The last light faded from the ridge. "Yes," she said. Just that, one word, the same way she'd said no to cord in the square. Quiet and clear and complete. He reached across the spaces between the chairs, and she put her hand in his. And they sat like that, while the stars came out one at a time over the valley. Lily appeared at the screen door with 2 kittens and an agenda. "If you're both just sitting there," she said, "you could help me with something." "What's that?" Clara said. "I want to plant that oak sapling, the one from the seedling box." Abigail said fall is the right time. Pushed through the door, with both kittens apparently committed to escaping. She said oak trees live for hundreds of years if you plant them right. She said the roots go deeper than the tree is tall. Silas stood up. Clara stood up. "Where do you want it?" Silas said. Lily had clearly already thought about this at length. "The east field," she said, "where the ground is good now, where the irrigation reaches." They got the lantern and the spade and the seedling in its box, and they went out into the dark together, the 3 of them, picking their way across the yard by lantern light, while the kittens waited somewhere behind them. The east field was cool and still. The soil there was loose and dark from the irrigation. Nothing like the cracked earth it had been a year ago. Lily picked the spot herself. She walked around for a moment, considering, and then she stopped and said, "Here, Silas dug." Clara held the lantern. Lily knelt in the dirt and settled the seedling's root ball into the hole herself, working carefully with both hands, pressing the soil in around it the way he'd shown her to pack a fence post firm but not crushing, giving the roots room to find their own way. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at the small sapling in the dark earth. "It doesn't look like much," she said. "Not yet," Clara said. Abigail said 100 years from now, it'll be bigger than the barn. Abigail's usually right, Silas said. Lily looked up at him, then at her mother, then at the sapling. "We should come back and check on it," she said, "every year, so we know it's doing okay." "Every year," Clara agreed. They walked back to the house in the lantern light, the valley dark and wide around them, and the stars thick overhead. And the small oak stood in the east field behind them, in the good soil, its roots already reaching down toward the water that had always been there, patient and deep, waiting for something to take hold. There's a moment near the end of this story that I keep coming back to. Lily, 9 years old, small enough to slip through a crack in the rock that no grown man could fit through, crawling across jagged stone with a wooden knife in her hand, sawing through the cord binding Silas's wrists. Not because anyone told her to. Not because she was sure it would work. But because she looked at the situation, found the one thing only she could do, and she did it. That's the whole story, right there in one image. This isn't really a story about a sheriff who turned bad or a water source worth killing for. Those things are in it, sure. But what this story is actually about is what happens when ordinary people, a tired widow, a broken lawman, a traumatized little girl decide that enough is enough. Not in a grand, dramatic way. Just quietly, stubbornly, one decision at a time. Clara Hayes never asked anyone to save her. When Silas stepped out of that crowd in Chapter 1, she didn't fall into his arms. She went home, climbed her porch steps, and pointed a rifle at his chest. Because she'd learned the hard way, through loss and grief, and 2 years of fighting alone, that trust isn't given. It's built. Slowly. With evidence. And that lesson applies to every relationship in your life, romantic or otherwise. The people worth keeping are the ones who show you, through their actions, day after day, that they mean what they say. Silas carried something heavy for a long time. He'd followed the rules, done everything right, and still watched a family die. And he couldn't forgive himself for it. A lot of us know that feeling the specific weight of a failure you couldn't have prevented, but still can't put down. Clara said something to him at that kitchen table that I think is worth sitting with. She told him he'd been carrying blame that wasn't the right shape for him, that he'd confused the system's failure for his own. That's one of the hardest things to untangle in life, knowing which guilt belongs to you and which belongs to something broken that was never in your control. And then there's the town. All those people who stood in the square and looked at their boots. Not bad people, most of them. Just scared people. Isolated people who each believed they were the only one who felt the way they felt. That's how power like Malachi's survives not through strength, but through silence, through making sure no one ever compares notes. The moment Clara walked into Abigail's kitchen and put that horseshoe on the table, the moment people started talking to each other and realized they weren't alone, everything began to change. That's a lesson that's as true today as it was in 1882. Silence protects the people who are already powerful. Speaking up protects everyone else. What I love most about this story is that nobody in it is superhuman. Silas gets burned, knocked down, and tied up. Clara is scared every single day and does the hard thing anyway. Lily is 9 years old and still figuring out how the world works. They're all just people, doing their best with what they have and who they are. And that's exactly why they win. Not because they're the strongest, because they refuse to stop, because they choose each other. Because when things get hard, they dig the way Clara's father taught her, the way the aquifer goes deeper in a drought instead of disappearing. The oak sapling at the end isn't just a pretty image. It means something real. You plant things you won't see fully grown. You build things that will outlast the hardest years. You put roots down in ground that's been dry and difficult and costly because you believe it has the capacity to hold something living. That's what love is. That's what community is. That's what courage is. In the long run, not one dramatic moment, but the willingness to keep showing up and keep planting, even when you can't yet see what's going to grow. If this story gave you anything, I hope it's this. Your worth is not decided by your bloodline, your losses, your gender, your age, or how many times you've been knocked into the mud. It's decided by what you do when you get back up. And sometimes the bravest thing in the room is a 9-year-old girl with a wooden knife and steady hands. Thanks for reading. I'll see you in the next one. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real